You know what would have been good to add? The flood thing.
Do it.
That's too late now. But might want to bring it up.
You can pull up a Google and then just share a different screen.
Could even watch the video.
Okay. I got a thing here from Dave Ellis said we're on.
I know. I'm just waiting and see if we can get the attendees who are going to join on the Zoom to
Okay, gotcha.
log in.
Man, there was like oh well.
Do you see that one where they had a thing flying over it?
This one.
They had like a drone flying over it.
I can't. Amount of water.
It's scary.
Yeah. All right. Ready to go?
Let's do it. You want to put your closing bell screen on so that we can still look fancy?
There we go.
Thanks, dude. Okay. So welcome back to Closing Bell. I think we're going to have a fun one today. We'll introduce our esteemed guest in a minute. But just as a reminder, because one of our IT wizards told me to remind you, because I always forget, if you have questions while we're talking today, you can plug them into the Q&A, and I will try to do a better this week of monitoring those questions, and so that we can get those to Jim, Hilker, the guys that know stuff about stuff. So Trey, take it away, man.
Yeah, well, good afternoon. I know it's Memorial Day Friday, and like in a regular year, that is like a big momentous occasion. It's a little weird this year. I feel like everybody's kind of on the fence, but I still feel like it was appropriate to drink an Oberon. It's finally Oberon season here in Michigan. So even though it's super cloudy outside and you know the world is flooding in northern or in mid Michigan, you know it's still summertime. Dang it! So we're gonna celebrate the right way. So today I think we're gonna cover a lot of stuff that is more of a kind of general rumblings that I've been hearing kind of from the ag community.
Rumblings or ramblings?
Both.
Yeah.
Ramblings would mean that, you know, it's like people talking and talking and talking. Rumblings is more like a grumbling, like this is just like this, and I'm upset about it.
I got it.
Really, I want to talk about that one. But to give you some context of where we are since last week, so for a while there, I think there were a lot of fears. I mean, we even talked about them at some length about protectionism setting in, particularly on grains, kind of globally. So now we're kind of sitting in this interesting place in terms of kind of global development of agricultural markets, where you even have articles coming out of like Bloomberg saying the world has too much wheat. And you know that might be kind of an oversimplification of what's going on in wheat markets right now. But the lead here to me is this reduction of fears about wheat shortages. So you know while we thought for a minute there that we might have some type of global food crisis, yeah, it really is not playing out that way. And by the way, like the whole line for a while is like, don't panic. Like, don't panic. We said it a bunch of times. Like, this is just evidence that like the system is super dynamic and we're playing through it. This wheat glut that they're talking about is kind of in part related to weather. So, you know, there is fear in terms of weather of what's going on globally. But it does look like we're going to come in fairly strong, at least according to the forecasts from the USDA that are being reported by Bloomberg. I don't know. That's just something that's important to highlight. Is again, we're not in a place where all of a sudden the world is going to starve because of COVID-19.
Yes, let's add a little bit of that. The problem all along with the wheat shortage, or talk about it, was a country not being able to get it because someone else wanted to give it to them.
Right.
Our normal situation in wheat is too much. And, you know, and the same thing, we could say the same thing for corn, the same thing for soybeans. So it's really what policies are left in place, put in place, changed, of whether individual countries may be short of wheat.
Right.
Wheat being kind of the most important one because it's a food grain versus the other two are feed grains. So it's the shortage. If we have a shortage, it'll be a policy type thing into some countries, not for the world.
And I checked right before we started, and Russia, who exports about 10% of the world total trade, international trade in wheat, still does have their export restriction on in wheat, which I guess you're saying is if we're talking from the perspective of our farmers, helpful in this, and that at least partially supports.
Yeah, but so on this, like, so we're talking about, I mean, you see this marked increase in global wheat production in terms of like hundreds of millions of tons. We're producing globally 100 million more tons than we were in 2010, 2011. But in the U.S., that trend line looks different, right? U.S. production of wheat.
U.S. production of wheat somewhat, but we've had pretty good yields the last couple of years, which has offset. It is
planting acreages are down, right?
We planted less wheat last fall, winter wheat, than we planted since the data started being collected in 1909. We planted the fewest amount of acres. We've had 2 good yields the last few years. It looks like we'll have a decent one this year, not as good as last year, but the real key in the world thing is other people have picked it up, and other people actually have a lot of preferred wheat.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, so that trades into the next slide. It was probably important to introduce, probably should have done this at the beginning, although Jim Hilker probably needs no introduction. Hilker was in the department from 1982. And
it kind of looks like he died.
I know,
the way
right.
You've got that set up right there.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. I didn't.
Right there.
Although, I mean, that beard is that's like a 3-week beard too. Like, that's not. It's impressive how much of a beard he grew, because this photo is the last known photo of Jim Hilker before COVID-19. So
that was like 2 years before. It's December 18.
Well, that one is, but
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So this is Jim Hilker eating chicken gizzards in Potterville. So Jim has been studying grain markets, commodity marketing in Michigan with an emphasis, but literally since longer than I've been alive. And Schaefer too, and Schaefer's older than me. I just want to highlight that. But so Jim has been following this stuff since that 80s farm crisis. So talking about, what's going on now versus what was going on then, Schaefer and I could speculate on it, and I think we probably would have something of value to talk about, but it made sense to us to kind of reach out to somebody who literally was living it, and trying to figure out how to address that in extension during the moment that it was happening. So this is a photo from our Ag Credit Conference last year. Now, I don't really know what the Ag Credit Conference is going to look like this year for kind of COVID reasons, but Jim was a fixture in Michigan Ag for forever. If you go anywhere and you talk about AFRE in the state of Michigan, somebody's going to be like, "Oh, is Hilker still kicking around?" And that is going to be a weird conversation for a while, because everybody I'm going to talk to in Michigan is going to bring up the weird fact that Jim Hilker isn't a part of the department. So with that, Jim, I'm hoping you can kind of help us think through exactly what looks different between what we've got now and the 80s farm crisis.
But wait, time out. Jim,
okay.
Before you start your rant, I think we've got a really good comment or question here that alludes to the wheat point you made there. A lot of the stuff we grow in the U.S. looks different than a lot of the stuff they grow other places. Where Larry Jacks here says, my homemade bread consumption has gone up by 6,000%. Since being at home, there is constant fresh bread on the table. And so I wonder if what your thoughts are there about that change in the way that we our food, in the kind of relative prices of you versus other kinds of wheat.
Well, first of all, I'm jealous, because at the beginning of this thing, we tried to buy yeast and we couldn't find any. So my wife, one of the reasons I married her is she could make wonderful homemade bread, that and fried chicken. And she's not home right now, but she is watching. And so I got excited about having homemade bread again, and we gave up looking for yeast. It's probably out there now. My guess is the question partly is, are they eating a lot more homemade bread than they ate store-bought bread? My guess is they started off, the answer is yes, because it's so good. But that's really big. Is any more wheat being
so homemade bread versus store-bought bread, or store-bought consumption versus food away from home?
Wheat used for flour to make bread, are we using more of it because of this situation and less of it?
Mm-hmm.
And I would say at this point, we're still probably using less of it going in our stomachs for a number of reasons. But
I think there's something there too that, like, okay, so there's been in terms of percent change of people making bread, huge increase, but it was a really small percent of the population.
Zero. Yeah.
So like, it's really not going to be, in my mind, it's not going to move the markets that much, because it's still a small share of the production system that's going toward making their own bread.
Well, I want to make a plea
to bigger point
show to make me some homemade bread.
The bigger point of substitution away from home to at home, and the types of foods we eat at home, I think there's a big story there.
Oh, I do.
Yeah.
I just went back to the wheat consumption, but the story is bigger than that, way bigger.
Well, but I mean, even it's a bigger story for wheat than the baking my own fresh bread.
Yeah. I mean, I think there has been a constraint on choices all over the place. Like, I mean, I bought Subway sandwiches yesterday, and like, I was very constrained on the buns I could order from, which is such a first world problem that I'm like, well, I can't get my, mozzarella baked Parmesan bread thing that I like. And so but it was still delicious, So
shout out for Subway. Jim's plugging his wife, and you're plugging Subway.
Oh no, I'm not. Their online ordering system was terrible. I will revise and resubmit on their online ordering system.
But what I'm trying to talk about is the fact that we're not all chefs at home. So I think we do eat a lot more bread sandwiches at home than we would if we were going out for food away from home, just as a general rule. So I can see maybe it's not fresh homemade bread we're producing or consuming, but as in Jim's of bread going into my belly, wheat going into my belly, I can imagine that increasing relative to other types of foods.
Yeah, that's a good question. We'll have to get into it later.
And that is real interesting. It's gone down gradually but consistently over the years, most years.
Wheat consumption, bread consumption.
Yes.
Okay.
Now, Jim, now you can rant on the 1980s.
Okay. The first thing I'm going to try and do somewhat of a comparison between now and then. And one big thing I want to say up front is this farm crisis, because to some degree it is for a lot of producers right now, isn't over yet. So we can talk about differences, and I'll try to, but I don't think we can compare them, and don't want to get into comparing, quote, better or worse, because we don't know where this one's going to turn out. The net farm income we have in front of us is about a year or so short, but it's not very much different than the last 3 years. We did have a bump up in 18 or 19 a tiny bit, and we don't know what's going to happen this year, but it's going to be down. It's going to be down a lot. As Alex reminded me before this show started, over the winter, I told farmers what the price of corn would be within a nickel, and now we're 50 cents lower than that. And I said soybeans couldn't go under 840, and we're way under 840.
Glad you retired.
It's one thing about forecasting, just about the time you think you're good and get us well ahead, it pops.
So,
And
okay, so let me critique this figure. If I look at this figure and I don't know the context of what's going on in agriculture, I'm going to say, man, it must be way better to be a farmer now than it was in 1970. Like, there's just way more money. My net income has increased significantly sinch then.
okay,
Why is that not true?
These are nominal dollars,
Okay, so we got inflation in there.
which is considerable in this.
What else?
That's kind of the biggest thing.
No. In terms of the people who are operating,
I think the debt to
Okay.
asset ratio is way too important now. Like, I think there's a balance sheet piece here that like this net farm income isn't capturing.
That's true. First of all, a lot of things in value here aren't there. It doesn't do anything next to the equity one, and that goes back. If we look at if you could flip down to prices for 1 second, you see the 1960s, how low that was until we got to the 1970s. Okay, that's important because there's been 4 golden eras in agriculture. Okay, just after World War I, just after World War II, the 1970s. Okay, now it stayed there, but the prices, but those are real prices, somewhat made up by better technology and more yield. And then the ethanol situation, which started there right about the time that the country went into 2008, 2009 recession. So I wanted to show you this to have a little background in 1960 before we go back to the 70s. So we can go back up, please.
Back here.
Okay. Yeah. So those net farm incomes, the other thing that shows farmers are doing pretty good compared to society, if you see how small the green is, that's the government payments parts. And they receive some government payments under this program or that almost every year, whether prices were good or whether prices were bad.
But that green looks like it got a lot bigger after 1980.
Yeah, the green got a lot bigger. The other thing that green does is that is an absolute amount, okay, divided among all farmers, but all farmers didn't have the same government program opportunities. Some farmers chose not to be in the government programs. Other farmers, you get paid on something called base acres. I think most of our viewers know what that is.
I wouldn't assume that. Talk it through.
Base acres, and you may have a very small percent you're getting paid on, or you may have a very high percent you're getting paid on. So the price drop in there was pretty significant, as that can be shown by the price drops big, you know, because the government payments are fairly high.
But so, like, if I look at this, that it looks like it's really 1 year that was the 80s farm crisis.
Oh, yeah, and that's where I'll give it 2 or 3 because prices were, some inputs and some other things were going up at the time. But that's in net farm income, and that's a really big point. So let's go to the one we're in now. I'm going to tell you most of that is due to lower prices.
So
this here.
And this is corn prices, but you're saying that this represents kind of, I mean,
yeah,
substitution's pretty simple.
Farmers adjust extremely quickly. Soybean prices within a year or so did the same things. Wheat prices, not as highly correlated, but quite correlated within the U.S. as far as better or worse. So if you look at these prices here, yeah, it was a 2 or 3 year period. That the high price there right after that 1980 recession line, just to identify it. Mm-hmm. We got those high prices because of a government program. We had so many stocks from the low price the year before that the government offered a set aside program that you could set aside up to 50% of your crop. So a large number of farmers did that. And then we had a wicked drought in 83. Used up much of the surplus. So corn prices went up there, but they didn't have a lot of corn to sell. Or it varied tremendously among producers, but lots of producers did not get to take advantage of $3.25 corn.
Okay, so we got government money that's coming in. Where are international markets here?
Okay.
In the 80s, were we exporting and importing corn the same way?
This is a good point. The main difference, I called the other one the ethanol jump in prices. This was called an export jump in prices.
Which one?
The 70s.
Okay.
Some of you may recall the what's called the Russian grain theft or whatever. Russia made a significant
something to throw out just casually. Russian grains theft or whatever.
That's a movie to me. Like that sounds like some.
This was one of the neatest things on their part, not our part.
Okay.
Basically, Russia, when they had a good crop, their people ate well. When they had a poor crop, their people ate bad. In the early 70s, they made a big commitment to feed their people. So in 1972, 73, they came in and bought a lot of wheat at once from the 5 or 6 major grain people, and none of the others knew that the other was selling it. So they bought a massive amount at low prices, and that year farmers didn't do very good, but right after that they did. The prices went up the next year dramatically. My father-in-law sold at the highest cash soybeans had ever been in the 1960s at $12. Now, they wasn't for a long period, but $12 soybeans. How'd he do it? Well, he was laughing at the elevator guy, sell my last 200 bushels if it hits $12, and he went to Florida and they hit $12.
Wow.
But so things like that happened. A lot of farms were paid for in this period. So people were doing pretty good. And then now let's start looking at some of the differences. If we go to land, I think is land prices next?
Yep.
Okay. Look at how land prices got started bidding up in the whole 70s. Okay. That follows along. Sometimes I think the corn price picture does a better of how people's income is than the net farm income pictures, but
okay.
Look how much land prices were bid up until right about 1980. They were bid up because of these higher returns, significantly higher returns. Again, back to my father-in-law, he paid for his farm over that time period. He did not buy much more land, but he paid for what he had. So land prices went up and up. And I remember hearing, and you guys are old enough to remember hearing, you guys remember 2008, or is that too long ago?
I remember 2008.
I was born by 2008.
Okay. People would say, could land prices drop? They'd never have gone down before. An economist would say yes, but everyone else would say no. Some of you may have heard that same quote, but I forgot how long 2008 ago was for you. It was yesterday for me. No one expected the housing market to drop. It had never dropped before 2008. Well, a lot of the same things were going on then that happened here.
In the 80s. In
the late 70s, early 80s. And as we all know, it crashed. So if you bought land at that high level, look at your equity position. And just because your equity position dropped, your cash flow didn't go up. And in fact, we have a few years there where cash flow went down, even if it was just 1 or 2 years. But your debt was amazing.
So in this same moment, in the late 70s into the 80s and everything, so I moved here from Oklahoma, so my first thought is energy, right? Yeah. So this same period of time was this like energy boom and bust cycle that happened. Like to me, when I start thinking about that space, and Alex hates my props, but here it is.
Oh no.
So Boomtown, fantastic book. One of the best books I've read in years. It's about Oklahoma City specifically. But the one that's more of the dark horse is Funny Money. Okay, so Funny Money is this book about the Penn Square Bank crisis that happened right along this kind of trend and trajectory, where you had people that were basically more than willing to give out these massive loans to energy investors and speculators in energy markets who are trying to wildcat through the state of Oklahoma, Texas, parts of Kansas. And so there was just like money that was available that ended up bringing down Continental Illinois in Chicago. So where is energy in this story?
Well, energy wasn't as big a part of this story. It was only in cost at this time. So yes, their costs did go up at the same time, both because of nitrogen, which, is a huge cost, especially for corn, and drying, mostly corn, as well as, we drive tractors, we drive combines. So fuel costs are a significant portion of a farm's cost. So when did oil price hit their peak in that era?
It was a mid-80s. It was after this farm crisis.
After, okay, but so the point is that energy is always a player and fertilizer is always a player, but that wasn't, I think, the main player over this time. We go back to those land prices there. It dropped, so there's the equity. Now I want to say, we say, well, farm prices have gone up after that. You notice farm prices have not dropped this time. Okay.
Hold on. This time.
Excuse me. If our peak period, what appears to be turned into a farm crisis over the last 3 years, and you have to be determined how long it is. You don't see land prices. That surprises me some. But there's some pretty big differences between how land prices got to this level and how they got to the previous level. Previously, much less money had to be put down. There were the people that paid for it. It's amazing how many farmers have no debt.
Really?
So a lower had to be down. So maybe 35% had to be put down. The big jump in the 2007 to 2010, the banks actually, and especially Greenstone Farm Credit, dramatically remembered the 1980s, and they insisted on at least 50% equity in any land purchases before they would give a loan.
Wow.
So farmers were in a much better position to own it. I mean, to have they were in a better monetary position, financial position going in than they had to here. The other difference is, and we're going to get to it, so we know where we're going, is can we go to interest rates for a little bit? Okay. So a lot of these purchases happened in the 70s, and even later in the 70s in here where, interest rates got into the 7 or 8% or so, but that wasn't as odd as you can see here at that time. But a big part of the story is at that time, variable interest rates were a big deal. A lot of land was purchased with variable interest rates. So your interest rates didn't just stay at that 7.5 or 8%. They went up to the 17.5. They went up to the 19%.
When you hit that 1980s farm crisis. Because so what we've got up now is 30-year fixed rate mortgage averages.
Okay.
And so this is real estate markets, but it lines up, I think, really interestingly, because look at so the gray on all of these things, by the way, are recessions. And so look at the interest rates during that 80s recession and where those interest rates are. They line up perfectly.
They were drove up a lot because inflation. I mean, this interest rate was driven up for large reason to stop inflation. which was fairly rampant in the 70s, like 6, 7, 8% at times. I'm probably a little high, but compared to today, really high. So when it got up that high, people couldn't pay their mortgages. Okay, so a lot of land, it looked like more land was going to become available than it actually did, but a lot of land became re-available on the market, but nobody wanting to buy it. Because you don't want to be in on this interest rate. You just got killed on variable interest rate. So, you're not going to take a chance that it goes back up to 19 or 20%. So as we went into this, the amount of equity that was lost and those loans that still had to be paid. And remember, you take 100 farmers, it might only have been 20 or 25% or a little bit more that had these huge debt problems, but that's massive. That's enough to bring down the value of the land, which affects everybody because of their balance sheets.
But so let's talk about the size of these farms in 1980. They were smaller farms then, right?
Yes.
So there were more smaller farms. So like 25% of the farms going out now would be a larger cut of the production system, right?
Way larger.
Could be. I guess it depends on what farms would have gone out in the 80s.
There were more medium-sized farms, if I remember right. So we've just seen a carve out of the middle. We've seen the same number of small farms and sort of a growth in the big farms.
This was one of those things that did it, because a lot of the 500-acre farms, which have gone away for different reasons, in Michigan, especially, they work full time at GM and farm 500 or 600. We didn't. There's graphs out there, the amount of farm income versus off farm and things like that. So for the small farmers, most small farmers had off farm jobs. And the ones that didn't, well, they went with the medium sized farms. The other thing is hopefully more of the farmers are younger like you guys.
Now?
Farmers.
No, farmers are
all
not,
farmers are 300 years old.
No, yeah, but all farmers, look at the data. All farmers have been 300 years old for the last 70 years.
Well, now they're 301.
Yeah, that's about it. They're up about a year.
Yeah.
I mean, it's been 58, 59, 60, somewhere in there as long as I can remember. It's a little bit on how you define ownership and a bunch of things.
Fair enough, yeah.
If you weren't, we got rid of, the other thing they got rid of is some farmers are poor farmers, or were. I would argue that's another difference. We won't have farmers going out that are poor farmers, and we had farmers going out in the 80s that just really weren't that good of farmers.
Well, that has to do with your net income graph. That's sort of what I was trying to hint at earlier with your net income graph.
Yeah,
you lost the marginal farmers?
Yeah.
And so you have more efficient or
exactly
effective farmers?
That plays into my story in the graph. I agree. It tends to show it.
Okay, so this number, to me, is it fair to say this is the biggest reason why this isn't the 80s farm crisis?
No.
Yes.
Well,
no.
Okay, then tell me
what is the biggest one?
Well, just that this is not a farm-specific crisis.
Okay. Well, interest rates.
But there were a lot of things that were in crisis in the 80s.
Okay, interest rates, I wouldn't say were caused by farmers.
Okay.
I would say it was no more caused by farmers than COVID-19. Now, it is a more regular
caused
one.
by Volcker? Sort of.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
We got rid of inflation since. Now, whether that did it or not, I don't know. I'll leave that to the macroeconomists, but we haven't had it since, and the market gets spooked a lot quicker. Look how little the interest rate, okay, there is a little, had to go up in 2007 and 8 to spook the market.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm back to the general economy.
Yeah, okay.
Look how little it had to go up in late 2000s to spook the economy. Now, there was
Interest
other
rates.
things that caused the recessions besides those two, but they're part of that was part of it.
Well, you can either just ignore this and finish your thought, or you can do whatever you're going to do. I think it's sort of easy to say, all right, this doesn't look like the 80s crisis. But I'm wondering if, since you've been following all this stuff since the Civil War or the beginning of time or whenever you started at MSU, are there lessons we can learn from the 80s farm crisis?
I think so. One of the things we can learn, okay, they learned going into this thing. They did not lend with variable interest rates, and they did not lend if you didn't have a lot of equity to put into your farm to start with. And I think maybe it's helping now as far as how deep it goes, but I think it also will play a big factor on how quickly we can recover. Okay, now those were already in place.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that is very much the same right now is cash flow. My cash flow is not enough to pay my debts across the board. So I said, yes, this person has more equity still in these high priced land, but if you're not getting enough cash flow to pay for this land, even at a low interest rate, you're hurting. So the biggest similarity between the two, and almost of everyone, is the cash flow. There's less of it depends on your commodity whether there's been the drop in equity. For cash crop farmers to date, they haven't lost their equity as bad. Although right now the banks are paying less attention to that. It's cash flow, cash flow, cash flow. Can you pay me on the debt? That's different than dairy. Dairy's lost equity. Their cows are a huge part of their equity, and they've lost them dramatically. So they don't even have that to borrow on in the short term.
So
to get to the longer term.
Okay, so this 80s farm crisis, in my mind, it's usually like a cash crop thing. People are talking about wheat, corn, soybeans, or some mixture of row crops, right? Where were dairies at in the 80s? I actually don't know.
Okay. You need one person to study dairy because it's more complicated than all the rest put together.
Yeah.
But you might have heard of a dairy cow buyout in 85 or 86 that really upset the beef people. So this is only a couple years before you're born.
Getting closer at least.
So we were stagnant, but the government support program for dairy set the price. Okay, so a little bit one reason they had to buy out here is we had every cave in the country full of cheese. And I'm probably going to get in some trouble from the dairy people here. So they had this buyout, I would argue, almost to help take care of the government program, because the way you keep the price at a support level is buy extra stuff.
Mm-hmm.
That's the government cheese era, right?
Government cheese area. Cheese was the biggest thing, of course.
So actually, there's a really good Plan of Money podcast episode. If anybody listens looking for a podcast, Plan of Money is a great one. And there's a whole episode on this government cheese thing that I knew about, but I didn't know the story. That dairy is just so unique in my mind. It freaks me out when I think about it.
It did not become a commodity like the others with price risk until the mid-90s. So it was how this government thing goes. So now, if your support price doesn't go down at all and you get rid of a lot of cows, what happens to the cow numbers quite quickly? They go right back where they were.
Sure.
Right.
I mean, there's biology involved in this thing.
Right.
So talk to some rancher or beef people. They've still never forgiven dairy for this.
Okay.
Because it did for a period of time hurt beef prices. I mean, that put a lot more beef on the market. As someone, well, I think of it, someone mentioned earlier, exports of grains in this country have kind of stagnated since the increase in the 70s. So if we want to, if we want to have higher usage of our corn, wheat, and soybeans for whatever reason, other than soybeans, went up a little bit at the end, but corn hasn't, wheat hasn't. It's been stagnant in absolute terms. I mean, there's world famine, we export more. There's worm and glut, we do less.
So,
but if you look at a graph of corn exports or wheat exports, it's flat and wheat's a little bit down.
So when you talk about this, then you're saying that like that bump from 1975 to, or 1972 to 1975, that's exports. That was an increase, a massive increase in exports.
Yep.
And then you have kind of, obviously there's some stuff going on in the 80s, but the trend line there stays kind of flat like a shelf until, and then that next bump is ethanol.
The next bump is ethanol. I call it almost solely ethanol. If you talk to University of Illinois, they'll call it, and there's something to this, ethanol plus China and demand for soybeans.
Okay.
I would say that's a fight for land. We wouldn't have had any trouble supplying the soybeans. But if you have to do the ethanol, the fact that these soybean exports went up at the same time exaggerated the prices of both.
Okay, so you were working hard in this industry before ethanol, right? Before that became such an important part. So now, I mean, even the Michigan Farm News is publishing articles saying like, is this the collapse of ethanol? What do you think?
Are we going to keep driving as few miles as we have now?
Probably not.
I think the answer is no. I think, to me, the growth in ethanol had already stopped. And we have had some years where it's gone down or up a little bit. But you go back, I forget what it's 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years, and for all practical purposes, ethanol production, corn used for ethanol production has been pretty constant. That has given us slightly more ethanol due to efficiencies. We get more out of it.
So do you think that like saying that this is the collapse of the ethanol industry is kind of doomsday? It's a little too far upstream?
I think so. The government would have to change a rule.
Yeah.
You know, we still have to have a certain percentage as ethanol. You know, now they're getting it pretty cheap. I read something that a few of the ethanol plants have opened back up.
Oh, really? That was going to be my question.
Now I wouldn't call it enough that this is a big new trend. Who knows? Another one may shut, but you know, so there has been some positive returns to ethanol, at least in the sense many of these plants are paid for. I mean that they're costly to maintain and update and everything. You know, was ethanol the way to get corn prices up versus food? I'm not sure. I would have rather the world ate a lot more food, but that would have mean raising world incomes. But we have a lot of communities built around these things. So I think the cost of kind of maintaining that till it either gradually goes out or whatever would be cheaper for society than stop supporting the rule we have.
But what about in the short term? This, you said, are we gonna keep driving again one day? Well, I freaking hope so. But when that day comes, I don't know. And so if in that interim these ethanol plants go broke, you can have a blending mandate. You can set it as high as you want, but if we don't have the capacity to blend, then there is no ethanol. I know that but just to highlight that point.
Is that in a probability set? Absolutely. Even if we go back, so a lot of the first plants of the new type were built 2006, 2007 was they really went. Those aren't brand new anymore. And there's still a few of old ones left around. My guess is if those are closing, they'll never open back up.
Okay. Yep.
We had a huge one in South Bend that I think kind of eventually went away, and I don't see it coming back. I don't see any new plants being built or even any new capacity on the plants. Like at Albion doubled their size of their plant 2 years ago, and I might be 3. I can't.
Yep.
But they're really good at it. So no, if you're thinking of growth in the ethanol thing, I think that might be a lower probability of happening than yours of it collapsing quicker.
What share of the capacity are you saying has shut down that you think is not coming back? What share of our pre-coronavirus capacity?
I don't know if I can give you that number very well, but
Okay.
given the amount they're predicting to be used this year, it can't be a real high percentage. I mean, if you look at the last USDA supply-demand balance sheet, the number looks kind of high from what I was reading in the news.
Oh, really? Okay.
So either someone's stepping it up, the USDA is too optimistic, but even if they're a little optimistic, they don't have it down a whole lot.
Sure.
Last year.
Okay, so let me jump into a question that's a completely different angle.
Yep.
But we had a question from the audience, and this is a question that is one of those things that I think a lot of people are talking about, and I know that like Brian Brigham and I are gonna have a phone call next week, and we're gonna argue about this. So inflation was a big deal in the 80s and 70s.
Yep.
And so I mentioned Volcker. So Volcker was the chair of the Fed at this moment in time. And so Volcker intentionally raised the interest rates in the United States to try to curb inflation.
Yep.
And so why is it that like back during the financial crisis, we had quantitative easing, we dropped the interest rates, we did all these things to try to kind of, increase cash flows throughout the United States with monetary policy. We at the time, so Tom Honig he was the chair of the Kansas City Fed. He was the only person who voted against the quantitative easing on that FOMC board. Mm-hmm. Everybody else was on board with quantitative easing, but his argument was that we're going to increase inflation with this policy, and it didn't happen. Now in this crisis, we 2008 quantitative easing and all the policies in 2008, they don't even. They're not even worthy to tie the shoes of the amount of money that we've thrown into monetary policy at this point, mm-hmm. and fiscal policy. So what's going on? Why aren't we seeing inflation? Will we see inflation? That's a story in the 80s farm crisis in my mind.
I think we don't know the answer yet, because remember what the definition of inflation: more money chasing the same amount of goods.
Okay.
Well, right now we don't have the money chasing those goods.
Oh, that's a really good point, dude. That a lot of this stuff is being stored up.
Inflation, and then we got to get through it. And then could inflation hit? Yes, but yes, this is way smaller than the 2008 quantitative easing, but pretty much everyone there thought we were going to, not everyone, but lots of people there thought we were going to blow it out of the inflation out of the roof, and that's why we started raising them from 0. What did we get to 2%, 3%? We didn't get very high, but until last fall, we had several increases, and their reason for increases were worried about inflation, and we haven't seen it.
We have seen inflation in food prices, though.
Yeah,
just a tiny little baby bit.
Depends on what food you're talking about, but
that and how long a period of time makes a difference, I think, is
right.
As well.
Well, and the Fed's watching core inflation, which doesn't even include food prices. So,
now I've heard some, but I can't repeat them, a little bit on why we haven't seen this inflation. But boy, would I be interested in another answer, given I lived through that other era.
Well, we started talking about inflation in one of our first two episodes, and then that fear kind of went away. So thank you for reviving that fear for me.
Yes, but remember, we got competing fears. Like maybe we'll have to deal.
I've got a lot of competing fears. Yeah.
Every day of my life is a competing fear.
Let's deal with inflation when we see it happen.
Yeah, fair enough. I'm not sure that's good planning, but
I know. Yeah. So because there is that argument that part of the reason that we haven't seen the inflation the way that we did in the 80s was because of the psychology of consumers. Because once it's in my mind that the prices are going to increase every year, then I'm going to start asking for more money in my raises to adjust for that inflationary period, and it just fulfills this cycle. And so that's why the 80s in my mind hurt so badly, because we had this psychology of inflation that Volcker literally stepped in and just crushed, and it hurt like hell. So like, are we doing the same thing again, or is this a completely different thing?
To build on that, if you look at real wages, it's been a long time since they've gone up a significant amount, and wage inflation tends to be the biggest driver of inflation, or a big part of it, because the increase in cost. It's the biggest cost of goods. Tends to be labor,
yeah.
Or huge anyhow. Depends on your industry.
Interesting.
I'm out of my comfort zone right here with all of this macro policy, but I wonder about if you could give some light on that unemployment figures we've been seeing and how that works with the inflation story.
Well, it goes back to the cost of goods. Is it playing a factor right now or not? I mean,
well, I'm just thinking you just mentioned real wages, and if the real wage is zero for a growing number of people, not zero, but you take my point, then that's going to offset the massive stimulus injections we're seeing.
Yes, until the time period where the massive stimulus projections quote work and the huge fiscal.
Right.
Well, there's both of them. We've seen it on the monetary and fiscal side. If those do what we hope it does, that means it may do a little extra down the road.
So I will say that you punched a hole in one of my like standard things about inflation right now, and it kind of pisses me off a little bit because like it's my go-to move right now. Is so in my mind, in the United States, we have kind of the standard currency of measure for many countries. So if you are looking for a safe haven to put your money or your assets, and you drop them into dollars, and so our market has become far more globalized. And so we're not just talking about, like, in my mind, in the 1980s, we didn't have such a globalized market. And so in a closed economy, it makes a lot of sense that like inflation had the potential to run rampant the way that Venezuela has seen. But because we have such a massive international market, what I would have to find in my head is an alternative stable currency for somebody to invest in. And if there, you don't think?
No,
your story still hangs in there.
Yeah, and exchange rates are different than inflation, but I also think it's different.
I think they're related.
Yes, they are. I agree, but I also think it's it's important to caution the things that Jim is talking about are not Venezuela, are not Zimbabwe hyperinflation events.
Those are closed economies, is what I'm saying. We have an open economy.
I actually like your point, Trey. I think one of the things that may have kept inflation down is it being a more open world market. Your costs go up too much, I'll make it over here.
Right.
Except for that, that's not. It's quickly becoming less true.
Nothing scares me right now as far as our economy more than less of a world economy.
Protectionism.
Amen, dude.
Yeah. Protectionism.
Obviously, the flu scares me the worst. I mean, this coronavirus. But-
That was the most old man thing I've ever heard you say.
Now you'll probably hear some more of them.
The flu, I mean the Kano virus.
Yeah,
Uh,
I mean, I'm following what you're saying, though.
family.
Like, yeah, it is scary to think that this thing could take off. But the protectionism, like when you think about the Great Depression, right? It wasn't necessarily that the protectionist measures like Smoot-Hawley were what caused the Depression, but my impression or my understanding is that it clearly prolonged the Great Depression. So
Exacerbated and prolonged, yeah.
They botched monetary policy. That didn't help either. But we learned from that.
One thing.
What's that?
There was more than one thing, but it
Yeah, sure.
certainly hurt us getting out.
Okay, so we have a couple more minutes, Jim, and I wanted to throw in just an open for you that I want to hear. So you were here when that 80s farm crisis was happening, and we have a lot of folks that are in extension right now that are probably tuning in or at least going to listen at some point. So when the 80s farm crisis happened, what kind of programs did you all decide you needed to implement and establish across the state that you felt like were impactful and that we might be able to use in kind of our own work now?
Our department at that time had 5 or 6, almost 100% extension specialists as faculty, highly trained faculty. They made partnerships with extension folks all over the state. They made partnership with our firm team, which was about 7 strong. We were lucky then, almost all of them had a lot of experience. And we put out a lot of information. Bankers were involved as well. So there was both material being put out and there was people working with families. Now, we still could hardly touch it as the whole, but I think it was useful. It also gave them hope. And I don't know, or, we weren't planning on this happening, whether it'd be nice if we could still get some more information out on there's a big problem with farmers being ready to talk to the banker. More than ever, there's more LLCs and everything. So your land is in one LLC, your crops are in another LLC, and your dairy, let's say you have another. And to put that information together so that the bank actually has a good idea of what your equity is. There's been some evidence that you see the bad, not good cash flow. That's the only part your credit people have seen. So loans are being turned down. So there is some of those out there that have enough equity that you'd hope if the financing could be laid out right, they could make it through the next few years and make some adjustments.
But how do we do that now? What kind of programs? I mean, is it, so in the 80s, and my first thing is this ag credit conference that y'all have at some point. You thought maybe we need to establish some type of conference to bring in bankers and kind of talk through some of these finance questions, right?
I'm not sure what we can do right now. Other than try and get out the best.
Well, that's cool.
I mean, part of it's a bunch of it is for the reason I just gave. You have resources or you don't have resources. And due to, in this part, not the fault of the university, resources aren't going up. On the other hand, we have Farm Bureau. I know we have people in here listening. They have an idea of this. Extension across the state does have it. So sometimes it's helping the people getting the right person to talk to. Another thing is depression sets in. Anything we can do to notice that among our producers for 2 reasons. One is the real serious one. We could lose them. But the other one is just getting them, there's situational depression. if we can kind of get them past that there are some resources out there when government programs do come along. I wouldn't be surprised if some low interest rates or something is done as we move down to help producers from the federal level. They almost always is. Every farm bill says we're getting rid of disaster aid, but when disasters happen, the Congress usually steps up to the plate. I mean, you can like that or not, and make sure producers know about this information when it comes. And part of it is talking about it. If it's more identified as a real problem, an issue, I think there's more likelihood we'll get help out there, and people will see that they're not the only one in the situation, and we can work together.
Yeah, that's a good kind of final point.
I think that's a closing bell right there, man.
Well, Jim, thank you so much for coming on. And the big thing is like, I don't know, for me personally, like I know it's kind of a dorky thing to say, but having you around for the last few years has been absolutely fantastic. It really sucks that you happened to retire in the moment of probably the largest economic crisis of my lifetime. So, but I'm glad that you're available. Thank you so much for coming on, and looking forward to drinking more beer with you down the road, man.
You're welcome, and yes, I will agree.
All right. Thanks, guys.
See you guys.
Bye.